For those of you that followed me during the lead up to the 2016 NFL Draft, you know I was a huge Carson Wentz proponent going back to October of 2015 when I tweeted that I thought Carson Wentz was the best quarterback in that draft. And I stand by that, and early on in the 2016 season, I'm being validated in some way. Now, on the flip side, I wasn't a huge proponent of Dak Prescott. I watched him at Mississippi State. I heard some of the people talk about how he was Tim Tebow-like, and maybe that was a little bit unfair, but I kind of got what they were getting at. I looked at a guy with less than ideal measurables, a less than ideal NFL arm. I had questions about whether or not he could really make all the required NFL throws, if he really had that it factor it took to be an NFL starting quarterback, or at least a good NFL starting quarterback. And then during the draft process, he got the DUI arrest, and I'm like, ugh. And I ended up putting, I think, like a 5th or 6th round grade on him. You know, a guy that without that, maybe he's a 4th round talent. I thought could be a solid NFL backup, maybe someday develop into a starter. Well, lo and behold, wouldn't you know, Tony Romo fractures his back in the preseason. Dak Prescott takes over. He starts lighting shit up, and people are all abuzz about him. And I'm like, let's pump the brakes here just a little bit. Let's see what happens once the season actually begins. Well, this season actually begins. And Dak Prescott, the guy who the Cowboys took in the 4th round, in large part only because the Raiders had jumped ahead of him and taken Connor Cook earlier in round 4, who was the guy that they actually, believe it or not, preferred at the beginning portion of day 3, has come in and done a solid job for the Dallas Cowboys. He's completing 2/3 of his passes. He's not turning the ball over, 0 turnovers through 3 games. He's taking care of the football. He's putting his team in positions where they could potentially win. They've been in all 3 games, and they're off to a 2-1 start as of the time of this recording. You've gotten out of Dak Prescott 3 games of solid, not spectacular play, but the type of quarterback play that's not going to lose you football games. It's going to keep you in games and give you potentially, in the 4th quarter, a chance to win games. And the Cowboys have been in the position each of the 3 weeks to win a game in the 4th quarter. Even week 1 when they lost to the Giants, they were in position to win. And if Terrence Williams gets out of bounds and they get a field goal off, maybe they do win. Maybe we're talking about a 3-0 Cowboys team. But when you look at Dak Prescott and how he's been solid, he's taking care of the football, the team is functioning without Tony Romo. You look at the injury history of Tony Romo, it's easy to just sit there and jump all on the Dak Prescott bandwagon. And, you know, it's in part, I think, a fascination always with the young rookie quarterback. The backup quarterback is always the most popular player on a team, especially if you don't have a franchise or elite NFL quarterback. It's kind of always that fascination with the next big thing, or the guy that could be that dude for the future. That's kind of a fan thing, you know, looking to the future and not so much always focusing on the here and now and in the present. And we have to be careful sometimes that we don't get too carried away with it, that we don't allow a small sample to cloud our better judgment. Because when you talk about Tony Romo, you know, I know a lot of people have things to say about Tony Romo, this or that, but here's a guy that in a lot of ways is a respectable dude, and I respect him tremendously. An undrafted kid coming out of Eastern Illinois. He's been the starter for the Cowboys since 2006. He doesn't get in off the field trouble. He doesn't do a lot of stupid things. You know, he's been a solid quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. I would surmise the 3rd best quarterback in the history of the franchise, behind Roger Staubach and Troy Aikman, and then it's Tony Romo. And yes, it's in that particular order. You're talking about a guy that has been to the Pro Bowl 4 times. He's taken his team to the playoff 4 times. You know, Tony Romo is a franchise NFL quarterback when he's on the field. And you can look back at 2015, and you can see the difference in the team when he was on the field and when he wasn't on the field. And you talk about the value and importance of a particular player. And Tony Romo fits into that MVP category. And if anything, what happened in 2015 only further validated that. That it gave us a greater appreciation of what he was worth and what he could do because he wasn't there. And we saw how the team was when he wasn't there. And as Tony Romo recovers from yet another injury, this time a back injury, you've got Dak Prescott, and he's playing well. He's not spectacular, but he's been good enough so far. Is it going to continue? Only time will tell. Is he the type of guy that can actually take you to the playoffs, maybe win the NFC East, and you can win playoff games with? We don't know yet. We just don't know. So the ultimate debate's going to come around when Romo does get healthy. Since he's the franchise guy and he's got a decade of history with the organization, he's the third best quarterback in the history of the organization. He's the better quarterback talent. He's got to be back in the lineup. Because you look at Dak Prescott and you say, this is a guy that you took in the fourth round. Teams passed on him in the first 3 rounds for a reason. He was taken in the fourth round for a reason, and 3 games does not ultimately a star make. And you look at Tony Romo, this is a guy that's put up some big numbers throughout his career. He's had some big-time seasons. Like I said, a 4-time Pro Bowler. He's been the guy there for over a decade now. Or a decade at least now. He's got more experience. He's got more playoff experience, more winning football experience at the NFL level than Dak Prescott. And typically you look at the history, especially a guy like Romo, an actual franchise NFL quarterback, those type of guys typically don't lose their jobs to injury, nor should they lose their job to injury. And let's face it, when you look at the Cowboys right now, yes, they're 2-1 with Dak Prescott, but we have to provide the full proper context. They played a Giants team in week 1 that they lost to, but a Giants team that's probably mediocre, slightly a tick above mediocre, but not much more than that. Week 2, they beat a Redskins team that isn't very good, and this year's results will bear that out. And then this past Sunday night, they played the Bears, who are a god-awful team, are going to be in the running all year for the number 1 overall pick in the 2017 draft. Hooray! It's not like they've been world beaters. They've gone out and beaten the Patriots and the Broncos and the Cardinals and the Panthers or anybody that's really, frankly, worth a shit in the NFL this year. So you look at it and you got to say, Dak's been good, but he hasn't been great. What happens if he drops off at all? How much is the team going to suffer? When Romo comes back from his injury, he's still got to be the dude. Because an 80% Tony Romo has got to be better than 100% Dak Prescott. You would think, and you would think. However, when it comes to that question of should they stick with Dak Prescott, I think for the Dallas Cowboys, for both now and the future, the answer is a resounding yes. Now look, as I've acknowledged, Tony Romo is the 3rd best quarterback in the history of the Dallas Cowboys franchise. Tony Romo has done a lot of good things over the years. A 4-time Pro Bowler, MVP candidate at times, and he's just the better NFL quarterbacking talent than Dak Prescott at this moment. That's just a fact. But what's more important is that Dak Prescott, in my opinion, is the better quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys in 2016. You drafted Ezekiel Elliott high. You've got some nice weapons in the passing game, notably Dez Bryant and Jason Witten. You've got a really, really nice offensive line with all those former first-round picks and Tyron Smith and Travis Frederick and Zach Martin. You could put a guy into that situation and not expect him to have to shoulder the load or take on all the burden of the team on his back. You need a guy that can manage a game, a guy that's going to keep you in it, a guy that's not going to make a lot of bad mistakes. And Dak Prescott does a good job of that. He's made some really good decisions. He's made some quality, accurate throws when he's needed to, and he hasn't put his team in disadvantageous positions. Well, the flip side of that is when you have Tony Romo, and yes, we could point to 2014 as an example of where they backed off of Romo a little bit, but at the end of the day, when Romo's in the game, it's about Tony Romo, and the Cowboys go with Tony Romo. So they're allowing him to run everything, ultimately call all the shots on the field. He gets into Peyton Manning mode, and he gets too cute, and he tries to audible out of every fucking thing. He calls a lot of option routes for his receivers, which leads to some miscommunications and some of the bad interceptions that Romo's thrown over the years. When you're a team like the Cowboys where your defense is not very good, they cannot generate any consistent type of pass rush at all. They are mediocre against the run. Their secondary is so-so at best. The number one key to your success is keeping your defense off the field as much as possible. And when your defense is on the field, giving them as much field as possible to work with, because the more field they have, the more chances they have to stop the offense and get the ball back for the Cowboys' ground game behind Ezekiel Elliott and Alfred Morris. When you look at this team and the way it's constructed and how it needs to be constructed and run in order to be successful, Dak Prescott gets him to a better place at this point in time than Tony Romo, in my opinion. I think Dak Prescott is a better fit as a game-managing type of guy than Tony Romo is in 2016. 2 or 3 years ago, I would have never said this. But now, a mid-30s Tony Romo with shoulder multiple shoulder injuries, collarbone injuries, not to mention now a back injury, a fractured back for Christ's sakes. I mean, if one thing, a franchise quarterback has to have the ability of availability, and lately Tony Romo just hasn't had that. So how much longer can you keep hitching your wagon to that star on the helmet of number 9 if he's not going to be on the damn field and he's going to continue to hold a clipboard? And let's face it, I don't mean this as an insult to Tony Romo or a knock on Tony Romo. This is just fact. The fact is, it's not just all his fault, but he is the quarterback. He's the leader of the franchise. As a result, you get the credit when you win. You deserve the blame when you lose, too. In his 10-plus seasons as a starter, they've only had a winning record 4 times. I believe it's 4 times. 4 playoff appearances, and only 2 playoff wins. So it's not like Tony Romo has a ton of playoff experience. It's not like Tony Romo has a ton of winning playoff experience. So how much are you really losing in that bucket when you go with a Dak Prescott as opposed to a Tony Romo? I mean, I think it's a fair question. Now, this is a Dak Prescott that comes from the SEC who recently hasn't exactly lit the world on fire when it comes to producing NFL starting quarterback talent. But honestly, when you look at Tony Romo, from a fantasy football standpoint, he puts up some really nice numbers sometimes. But at the end of the day, there's an awful lot of mediocrity and there's an awful lot of 8-8 seasons. And for all the media narratives about how Tony Romo's wonderful in fourth quarter and comeback game-winning situations, they fail to mention all the times in the really big important spots where Tony Romo came up short and he made a horrible decision. He executed a terrible throw. He made a horrible side adjustment at the line. He changed into a horrible audible, not to mention all the times that they had to come back in the fourth quarter because he was so-so in the first 3 quarters, kind of that Reggie Miller thing of, do we praise him for putting up 20 points in the fourth quarter, or do we knock him for playing like shit the first 3 quarters? Not to say that Romo always played like shit in the first 3 quarters, but I'm just saying we have to provide the full and complete context to that, what can be used as a misleading statistic. Furthermore, when we talk about Romo and we talk about Dak Prescott, one of the key things with a rookie quarterback, a young quarterback to be, is once you go with them, you've got to stay with them. Because if you go with them only to back off of them and you put them back on the bench, that has the potential to be a career killer. It can ruin that young man's confidence. Why sit there and have Dak Prescott start for you another 3, 4, 5, however many games, and maybe your team's sitting at 5-3 or 4-4, just to bring back Tony Romo and ruin Dak Prescott's rhythm for the rest of 2016? Why do that when there's a risk that Tony Romo can just get hurt again? It just doesn't make much sense. Why would I ruin Dak's flow and rhythm and his game-by-game progression to bring Romo back in, whereas Romo could maybe last 2, 3, 4 games and then he's out again, and now I've got to take a guy in Dak Prescott, a young quarterback who was starting to figure it out, and I've pumped the brakes on him for a month. Now I'm trying to shoehorn him back in, and I'm trying to make things go like they were before. It just doesn't make any sense. Why would I delay this guy's progression and potentially alter the chemistry of the team and the way things are functioning on the football field for a guy that I'm not even going to be guaranteed is going to be able to finish out the rest of the season? And even if he does, he's not necessarily the better systematic quarterback fit for what the Cowboys need to do and want to do at this particular moment in time. He's just not. And when you look at this from a big picture long term, every game that Dak could play is a learning experience. It's invaluable. You take away some of those games sitting on the bench, you're just not learning the same. And at some point in time, the Cowboys organization has to be honest with themselves, and they have to say, with Tony Romo, are we really a championship contending team? I think with the holes on the defensive side of the ball in particular, the answer is a resounding no. If you're not a championship contending team, what are you? What the Cowboys have mostly been for many of Tony Romo's 10-plus years as the starting quarterback, a mediocre, overhyped, overrated football team with more star power than results in the win-loss column. That's what it is. When you look at this organization, what guarantee do you have that Tony Romo is going to be any better than what Dak Prescott is giving you right now? And on top of that, when you think about this from an organization standpoint, let's say you do bring back Tony Romo and he plays adequately well the rest of 2016. Now you're going to go back into 2017 with him as the starting quarterback and Dak's on the bench again, to where you've not only ruined this young man's confidence potentially in 2016 and completely stunted his growth and affected his rhythm, now you're looking at potentially another lost year or two or more sitting behind Tony Romo. At some point in time for this organization, it's got to be about 2016, 2017, and beyond, more importantly, though. If you were going to ever win a Super Bowl with Tony Romo as your starting quarterback, it probably would have already happened. That's just the truth of the matter. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. You've found that out. You've had 10 years to figure that out. You don't know what you can do with Dak Prescott. And that's both worrying and exciting potentially at the same time. But why not find out? Because if you're the Cowboys organization, if you go through the rest of the season, and let's say you finish 9-7 with Dak as your starting quarterback, maybe you do miss the playoffs, or maybe find a way to win that division. Think about how much better your organization is set up long term that you made it to the playoffs, or at least had a winning record, or even finished 8-8. And you did it with a young quarterback who's only going to get better. Because if you do that with Tony Romo, you're just, again, a mediocre football team. And there's no real growth potential there. You're on that same plane, that same kind of tangent that's going off the tracks from ever being a championship contender. If you utilize the rest of 2016 for what it should be at this point in time, because frankly, this young man has earned it and he deserves it, at least at this moment, you've got to roll with Dak. You've got to stick with Dak Prescott. Because you've got to find out what you've got. Because if he tells you and shows you that he's the guy and proves that he's the guy and capable of being the guy this year, then for the Cowboys, they don't have to worry about taking a quarterback in the first round for potentially years to come. But if they don't sit there and stick with Dak and they bring in Tony Romo and then he gets hurt again, they got to bring back Dak, then you're creating more questions and answers and more confusion and more complications for the organization than you need to. It's just not necessary to do so. Furthermore, on top of that, you still have that wild card Tony Romo factor if you keep him on the bench. Let's say you stick with Dak Prescott, and then you get about 3 or 4 weeks to the end of the season, and Dak's really starting to scuffle and struggle, and he's putting his team in situations where they're starting to lose games in part because of him. Then you can bring in Tony Romo at that time to potentially try to save the season because it's giving you an outlook and avenue to be able to see what Dak Prescott potentially has. And if his play and performance ultimately indicates that he's not worthy of that spot, that will play out. Only time will tell. But if you sit there and yank the rug out from under him in another 3, 4, or 5 weeks, then you have just enough of a tease to suggest the potential possibilities of what could be without being able to fully determine what the potential of the actuality is. Of who he is as an NFL quarterback. Keep Tony Romo on the bench. Let him get 1,000% healthy. And if later on in the year Dak gets hurt or Dak doesn't play well, then you can go with Tony Romo. And maybe it's a well-timed move that can really give that Cowboys team a lift, a jolt, and help propel them potentially to the playoffs. But maybe you don't need to do that. And maybe Dak gets you there all by himself. And you don't need Tony Romo. Or maybe he doesn't. Well, frankly, if you're a Cowboys fan, you should know what I'm talking about. You've had more seasons with Tony Romo where you haven't made the playoffs than you actually have. So why not utilize this season for the long-term health and growth of this organization to find out what the hell Dak Prescott is and what he can bring to the table? From a stylistic standpoint, I honestly believe Dak Prescott's the better guy. He's more reliable, more dependable at this particular moment. Why would you ruin his rhythm just to bring in Romo so that way Romo could potentially get hurt in another 4 weeks, and then you're trying to throw Dak Prescott right back into the fire again? You know what you've got with Romo. And at the end of the day, if you need to go there, you can go there. But at this particular moment, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And right now for the Cowboys, they're not perfect. They've got a lot of flaws as a team, but it's not exactly broke. And Dak's doing a very good job. And he's going beyond just doing a very good job as a backup quarterback. He's going about things in a way that suggests he should be the long-term Dallas Cowboys starting quarterback. Personally, I think the Cowboys are insane if they go back to Romo as soon as he's healthy for some of the reasons that I outlined. For now, Dak's the dude, and until he proves otherwise, he needs to stay the dude because it's going to be the best thing for his career and potentially the Dallas Cowboys organization, not just in 2016, but beyond.